Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are. My name is Paolo Franco. I'm the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the International Energy Agency. I connect from Paris. I'm honored and pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion entitled Geothermal Joint Venturing, Startups, Innovation, and the Oil and Gas Industry. Now, the objective of this discussion is to discuss a number of questions, including why there is such a big momentum on geothermal now, what kind of technology innovation options can be envisaged, and what is the importance of joint venturing and the complementary role of startups and large corporates. Now, please note that I look at that with my eyes of the renewable division head at the IEA. So on that, I would like to say the IEA just published a net zero emission roadmap by 2050 in May, and there is a huge role of renewables. 90% of electricity by 2050, 70% of total energy by 2050. But geothermal is basically absent. So today I'm here to listen from the experts what we at the IEA have been missing in our scenario and why. But of course, I wish the expert to be convincing, and I will play a little bit the devil advocate, and I apologize for being a little provocative, maybe. Now, with that, I would like to invite the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Dee Hay, the geothermal lead at BP. Please, everybody, only take 1 minute to present yourself, name, title, entity, and a very brief description of what you're working in geothermal and where your interests lie. Dee, please.
Hi, so I'm Dee Hay. I'm delighted to take part in this panel, and thank you to the organisers for organising the session and for the opportunity to speak here. It's my absolute pleasure. I'm geothermal lead at BP, but what's brought me to this point is a long history in hydrocarbons. So I look forward to the discussion, Paolo. I think it'll be a good one. My background as a geologist is through the value chain. So from exploration through to production in conventionals and unconventionals. And I think there's a lot that we can learn both from the exploration space and the unconventional development technologies that have been growing rapidly and really delivering successfully over the past 10 years that we can bring to bear to geothermal. BP has now got a new purpose, which is geared towards increasing its low carbon energy sources and delivering those options to global customers and businesses worldwide. So it's a super exciting time to be part of geothermal and BP. This year, we announced our first serious investment in geothermal energy by partnering with Ever on developing closed loop geothermal systems that we hope can be implemented in BP projects. So super psyched to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dee. The next one is Lance Cook.
Okay. I'm Lance Cook. I'm Chief Technology Officer and President at Sage Geosystems. My background is basically 40 years in the industry. I spent 36 years at Shell, love Shell. When I retired there, I was Vice President of Wells Technology, and I was Chief Scientist of Wells. We'll get into the technology later in the talk. So, thanks.
No doubt. So, Lise Rodionov from Schlumberger.
Thank you. So I sit in the corporate team. I look after sustainability for Schlumberger. I've been doing that for a couple of years now. Prior to that, I was running our onshore business in the US and Canada. I have 28 years with Schlumberger. I'm happy to be here. This was a great event last year, so happy to be here. And geothermal for us is not new. We've been in geothermal for a while in Schlumberger. So we're excited about the topic, but in particular, this the joint venturing and partnership approach is aligned with the approach that we're taking for our investments in new energy. So thanks for having me and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And last, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Jewett. I am the Director of Strategy for Fervo Energy, which is a Houston, Texas-based geothermal energy developer. Much like the three other panelists here, I started my career in oil and gas, actually working for Schlumberger. I was a field engineer for a number of years, running well stimulation crews. And so I have, most of my background has been in oil and gas as well. Today, I am hyper-focused on utility scale electricity development from geothermal resources. And so, that's definitely the perspective that I will take in this panel. Is anytime I'm talking about geothermal, I'm typically talking about large scale utility scale production. Thank you so much, the organizers, for inviting all of us here. I'm super passionate about the interdisciplinary nature of oil and gas and geothermal energy. And so I'm really excited to be on this panel specifically and speaking about it with all of you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. So let me start with the first round of question, and I come to my point, what is new? So there is no doubt that geothermal has a huge potential. My background, I didn't say it, I'm a physicist by background, but since I worked in the energy field, I know that. But since then, not too much has changed, to be honest. So my first question in terms of deployment. Now, my first question to Dee is, why are so many partnerships and investment happening now in geothermal? And why, since you represent BP, why is oil and gas engagement in geothermal different this time compared to past interest?
Yeah. And it's a great point, right? As a geologist, I've watched geothermal for a couple of decades now, and I've been scratching my head wondering the same thing. But actually, there are a couple of really good reasons why now is the right time. So first of all, there's a global imperative to generate energy from low carbon sources, okay? The IAA analysis recently highlighted that really, really strongly. We need to find these alternative sources, and we need to find them now. And companies like BP have thoroughly engaged with that, and they recognize that we need to be part of the solution. Companies like BP will tend to favor wind and solar. We've seen that in a lot of recent investments, huge gigawatt scale projects being invested in for wind and solar. And that's fantastic, right? It's a step on the journey. But in fact, what we've recognized as we increase the mix in the energy sector of renewables, there are a few problems that we encounter. They're intermittent sources of energy. They're putting stress on the supply grid because of that intermittency. And sometimes we even suffer blackouts because they're not always on. So geothermal is a perfect energy source as a base load 24/7 energy that can be delivered consistently to the grid. So, why weren't we doing it 10 years ago, right? Well, actually, the piece is that 10 years ago, the ability to access geothermal energy was rather geographically limited. We had to go to places where it was obvious on the subsurface that it would work, and where we could access it easily with shallow wells, and where we had the right tools and techniques to do it. And so that was limited to, say, Iceland or Western USA, parts of Asia. But for a company like BP, we need an energy source that's scalable, that we can offer to multiple customers and businesses. So we're super excited about these recent technology developments. We recognize that they have true potential, and we think they can be scalable and implementable across the globe and offered to multiple different customers. And that's different to where we were 10 years ago. And some of that difference comes from that initial imperative. We need to be getting after low carbon energy sources, and batteries are expensive, and supplies might be short to come by, and we need some other energy source to fill that gap. But also because actually this is in our heartland. These are skill sets that we can bring to bear and help with the technology development. We're happy to venture with folks where we have a common goal but complementary skill sets to get us there.
Thank you so much, Dee. Now, my next, a similar question, but maybe from a slightly different perspective, to you, Lance. I mean, you moved from a big corporation and then you founded a startup. So from your perspective, why now is different from the past?
Good. So let me take you back, Paulo, to August 2020. California grid capacity equal demand. A lot of studies already taken place. Basically, they need more capacity. That's all agreed to. Now, if you listen to the IEA, base load equals green equals nuclear or batteries, right? To go with solar and wind. Solar and wind have done a fantastic job. Nobody can deny that. They are cheap. They are far cheaper than I would have ever estimated, and far cheaper than anybody I ever heard or ever read estimated. So they've done a fantastic job, but they need base load to match it. But nuclear or batteries are expensive. So you match that, you've got problems. I mean, you're going to have ratepayers revolt. But wait, Paulo, hold on. Geothermal in the world is number one. U.S. is number one in geothermal in the world. And most all of that is in California, not California, in the Western U.S. And it's baseload. And it cost about $5 million per megawatt added. That compares to solar and wind of about 3 million per megawatt add. So it does need to come down, but I think I'll mention some technologies in a minute, which I believe will bring it down. And it's got the potential now with these new technologies to be as cheap as solar and wind, which is a huge potential. Nuclear does not have that potential. I'm not so sure about battery, but I think batteries are problematic. Now look at Texas and New York. Texas had a huge grid failure in February of this year. Now, it wasn't so much a capacity demand issue as the capacity just failed. So there's an understanding right now that there's a desire in Texas to add some variability to the grid, something that if something like this occurs again. So there is a lot of interest. We're getting a lot of interest in what is called geothermal anywhere, because there are no volcanoes, there are no geysers in Texas. You've got the same sort of issue in New York right now. You've got grids that's becoming overwhelmed. So geothermal anywhere, why is it different? It's been around for 50 years, like you said. I've got a 212-page list of DOE reports on geothermal anywhere around the U.S. The U.S. has been mapped. The capacity, the potential for geothermal anywhere in the U.S. is very well understood. But it's been lacking a few key technologies. A big part of the problem is the amount of energy you get out of a barrel of water. It's of course nothing compared to what you get out of a barrel of oil. But if you've been watching this past last 2 days, there's 3 key technologies, I believe, that are right around the corner. They just need to be combined, and we're going to see big improvements in geothermal anywhere. One of those is the CO2 turbines, which were just discussed in the last output. Our modeling shows that you can go from 7 to 10% recovery to 17 to 20% recovery. You go to P rates in crystalline rock. What's happening in Forge? They're drilling 65 feet per hour at the Forge project. That is going to make drilling granites, etc., anywhere dramatically cheaper. If you've ever drilled granite, that's a great way to waste your life. It takes forever. Not a whole lot happens fast. 65 feet an hour is like is like drilling out offshore. So fantastic results coming out with those PDC bits. And then profile control that's also coming out of Canada. There's some really good progress there. And for EGS and actually almost any geothermal, profile control is very important. And it's been a very tough nut to crack. If we crack that nut, I think these three technologies are going to really push us over the edge. And we're going to become competitive. We're going to be competitive with wind and solar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lance, and also thank you for introducing a little bit the discussion on technology. And I would like to go in this direction with the next intervention with Lise. So what are the technology advancements that are occurring in geothermal that will increase its scale over the coming decade? Let's fix our attention on the coming decade, and how are those advancements being de-risked? Please.
Thank you for the question. I'm actually going to cheat a little bit because I think that capital stewardship is I think front of mind for a lot of us in the industry right now. And I think that there's opportunity for application of already at scale technology and process advancements from oil and gas to geothermal. Dee talked about a little bit that we could leverage in the geothermal space on both the drilling and the subsurface side. So if you talk drilling costs are, let's say, 40 to 50% of a geothermal project. There have been significant gains in drilling efficiency over the last decade. So applying those proven drilling efficiency advancements in geothermal has opportunity. To give an example, ENGIE is a commercial energy provider invested in geothermal, and they had a drilling project for a city in France, a geothermal project for a city in France to support 60% renewable. And the well design we had was not new to oil and gas, but it was the first of its kind for geothermal in France. And it was a multilateral reservoir section, 3 boreholes, a dogleg severity, which for those of you that don't know, this is a measure of the change in direction over a length, let's say 100 feet. So the more severe the dogleg is, the more difficult it is to drill. You can get stuck. So we have technology, Power Drive Archer, that's suited for high dogleg severity wells. We have a drill bit. Lance had mentioned that, diamond element, unique geometry for the cutters. It's good for difficult drilling. So well designed, but also we planned it, intersect the reservoir and the producing zone multiple times and stay in zone as long as possible. So, managing high dogleg severity, staying in zone, these are things that we do in oil and gas. So applying that in geothermal gives an opportunity to improve productivity. And in this case for ENGIE, it effectively doubled the original production capacity. On the subsurface side, you got heat and permeability among characteristics. There are others, but it's characterization and modeling, I would say. And I would say as well in the context of an integrated project approach. So just like in oil and gas, and again, it's already been mentioned, but moving from surface location selection to driven more by an understanding of the subsurface, you're going to improve cost, production, risk, and ultimately success. So again, for me, same for geothermal. So if you move to designing your drilling programs based on that clear subsurface understanding, you're going to improve production and injection performance, drill more efficiently, save money. And again, going back to that improved return on capital employment, which again, where we're competing from a cost perspective in this space, I think that becomes important. I would also, you mentioned de-risking, and it's not just specifically technology, but I think when you look at targeting location below, let's say deep geothermal below existing oil and gas reservoirs, then you don't just have the opportunity to leverage oil and gas technology and competency like you would in any other geothermal project, but you can also potentially leverage supply chain and existing infrastructure, both physical, but also commercial and relationship. And, in later field life in the oil and gas reservoirs, produced water management is something that you do. So there's cost trade-offs. You go deeper, costs go up, but there's also less corrosion, scaling potentially, and not to make this a geology lesson, but generally be more, less complex, typically larger reservoirs. So again, I think from a cost trade-off and risk trade-off perspective, there's opportunity. So like I said, there's new technology opportunities specific for geothermal, and we're exploring it as other companies are as well. But from a capital stewardship lens, I actually think there's some low-hanging fruit with respect to technology and process by leveraging already commercial at-scale technology from oil and gas inside geothermal.
Thank you so much. So Sarah, coming to you, I have actually two questions. One is how much interdisciplinary work and approaches and partnerships make sense? And the second, I return to my point, why now? Is that not true that in the past there are many investments that they have burned their fingers in geothermal? I continue asking if this is so appealing, why it has not happened yet. Can you give comments on this?
Absolutely. So I'll answer your questions in order, Paolo. I actually think that the expertise and technical capabilities of the oil and gas industry cannot be decoupled from the success of utility scale geothermal energy. Utility scale geothermal development is inherently interdisciplinary because much like oil and gas, really good development is focused on two things. And one of those is significant understanding of subsurface science. And the second is drilling expertise. You're really trying to answer two questions if you are developing geothermal energy. And the first question is, what type of geology and temperature conditions exist below the surface? And then the second question is, how can we best approach extracting that geology and temperature from a cost-effective standpoint and efficiently in order to make sustainable, long-producing systems? And I think that those questions are both questions that, if you didn't know that this was a geothermal energy panel, and here we are discussing, geologic conditions and ability to drill, you might think that we're talking about shale gas extraction or anything having to do with oil and gas. And so I think that it is actually a hugely interdisciplinary science. And I think that, that's sort of been discounted for a long period of time. I think that there hasn't been a ton of geothermal energy demand, and oil and gas companies have been hyper-focused on extracting oil and gas, which is what they're good at. And so I think that there actually has not been a significant amount of technology transfer between the two industries. And building that bridge is actually a bridge that entirely makes sense. And so I think that actually combining the expertise of the two industries is super important, because we are talking about a completely different commercial product. We're talking about selling electricity instead of selling a commodity that you can store in a barrel. And I think that that is why interdisciplinary work makes sense. And I think, from the why now perspective, geothermal has historically had like a pretty poor drilling success rate. If you look at the drilling success rate of the geothermal energy industry, it's around 70% for the last, 50 years, like Lance is talking about. That might seem pretty good, but that's 30% dry holes in the midst of your successful wells. And I would say the oil and gas industry, worrying about dry hole risk is so last decade for the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry has, approached drilling success in such a way that they're focused so much more on efficiency metrics and getting wells drilled quickly. And how can we eliminate minutes? I mean, when I was in the oil field, it was literally, how can we eliminate minutes in our day of non-productive time? They're not focused on, is this well going to be successful or not? They're focused on how quickly can we get these wells drilled and how effective can they be? And so, taking some of the productivity advances that have occurred in the oil and gas industry over the last 10 years, because of the shale boom, especially in the US, that makes 100% sense in the geothermal energy industry. So to me, the question of why now is we have an incredibly unique intersection of market development and technology innovation. And the market development, just like Lance said, comes from, decarbonization legislation that's hugely widespread. So many people are focused on climate change and recognize now that with high penetration of wind and solar and retiring of large-scale nuclear power plants and early retirements of coal plants, we are in deep need of reliable green power. And there aren't that many technologies today, aside from nuclear, which is great and hugely valuable, but also has some complications, and hydro, which we're seeing suffer hugely from a drought perspective. And so I think today we are in deep dirt if we can't come up with a reliable green solution. So there's huge market demand for our product that we can produce, which is non-weather dependent, which is firm, which means it's there when you need it, and potentially is hopefully dispatchable. So I think that's something that we're working on, and something that many people who are involved in geothermal are working on today, which is how can you turn your wells off and produce when the load is really, really there, and let solar do the legwork when it's able to do the legwork. So, that market demand is there. And then because of what the oil and gas has managed to accomplish over the last 10 years, the technology is there to be able to do it today. And in response to what Lance said, I think geothermal kind of gets a bad rep because everybody says, even the federal government, oh, this is a problem that we're going to be able to do years from now because we don't have the technology today. And I would argue that that's not the case. And I think the technology and the science has both come up a huge learning curve from the oil and gas industry and is ready to deploy now. So that would be my answer for why now.
Okay, I will challenge you on this, but later, because before I would like to introduce.
Paulo, do you mind if? Yeah, I was gonna. There was,
please.
If you don't mind, there was one other why now that the other three didn't touch on that I was going to maybe bring up, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. Go
no,
ahead.
I think that, and this is wearing my sustainability hat. A lot of the conversation and comparison of options is around, installed cost. There's some involvement in or evolution to say, let's look at system cost. But when you overlay kind of total emissions cost as well, and balance the triple bottom line, access to capital is going to be influenced not just by the shareholder returns on capital, but that sustainability lens. So in that context, when you think about kind of total project life cycle emissions, geothermal lands and compares very well also. So that extra comparator when you're talking about access to capital, I think will also contribute to the why now.
Thank you. I would like to go deeper now in the complementary role, at least this is my understanding, between this startups and the large corporations. And there are a number of questions coming from the audience. So before I completely open the floor to the audience, let me ask you the following. So how is this complementary role playing in de-risking the investments? Is my understanding correct that the startups are well suited to de-risk the concepts, and then the corporates have, of course, all the means to scale it up? Is this correct? Who wants to comment?
Shall I jump in there?
Please do.
I think partnerships work best when they're complementary. So you've absolutely hit on my favorite word when it comes to partnerships, because it's really important for oil and gas companies not to patronize or be arrogant and say, these oil and gas skills are already in our organization and therefore we can do it ourselves. Actually, no. I think what the startups bring us is something very unique, highly creative, a nimble way of approaching technology deployment and bringing in views and insights from different parts of the oil and gas business and bringing them together in a unique way. And so that's pretty special. So when BP and other majors invest in companies, they're looking for that special magic that they may have in-house, but it's either not being nurtured or encouraged, or it's not being recognized. So they're bringing in something special that BP doesn't have. But we're not like a venture capitalist organization. We are investing in a company, but our preference is not just to let it go and wait and see. We are going to be end users of this technology in the success case. So we hope that we can bring something to the partnership, which is different to what the startup brings. So for me, it is exactly what you described. There's something around optimization. So having the ability to say, you've had this great idea, now let's improve in a factory style, a bit like it's been done in the unconventional space. There's also a piece around large project management. It's cost efficiency, it's making sure that everything is tight and really good to go and efficient in all of your operations, through to supply chain, and then right down to managing the cost on bolts and managing contractors and bits and pieces like that a large organization has a lot of influence on. And then there are other bits and pieces that a large corporation brings, which are completely different from that kind of project-based optimization. So for instance, BP has a trading and shipping arm. So one of the appealing aspects for BP would be in the power market. So can some of these projects fall under the remit of trading and shipping for BP? Can we market the power, and can we get involved from that angle too? So completely separate from the project optimization piece, there can also be other sectors of a large corporation like BP that can come to the project.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dee. Can I hear now a perspective from a startup? Sarah, Lance, who wants to go first?
Yeah,
Sarah.
I'm happy to go. I think, when you asked this question, Paolo, I thought about I think it was a 2017 episode of The Energy Gang where Jigar Shah or Catherine Hamilton, I can't remember who said, wood companies didn't become coal companies, which didn't become oil and gas companies. And they were specifically talking about energy transition and debating the role of oil and gas in energy transition. I think that it's really, really hard when you're good at something and you have resources and processes in place and your organization's priorities are specifically directed towards one product and the processes around that product. I think it's incredibly hard to think about trying new things. And because of that, I think the role of startups in this type of experimentation is hugely unique. I think we as small companies can go out and find enough expertise to be really, really technically savvy, and then have the nimble ability to sort of try things and then fail or succeed quickly, and then go try different things or different versions on the first idea. I think that is it's sort of the value proposition of startups. However, I think that in terms of scaling, I think Dee is completely right. This is an enormous undertaking. So great, I go and prove out how to drill an effective geothermal energy system. If I want to scale that system, it's going to take enormous expertise in subsurface science and exploration, drilling, completions, supply chain, regulatory engagement, safety, headcount building, trading, like Dee said, all of these different power development, interconnection. It just requires huge amounts of expertise. And I think that that's where partnership and just totally makes sense from a scaling perspective. Is great if I go prove it out, but I need help in order to scale this on a national or even international scale. And so the role of that startups have to play is fabulous, but I don't know that it is exactly what's going to carry the industry to success.
Thank you very much. Lance, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add the big oil and gas have tried skunk works for a long time, creating little organizations which will work on geothermal. But you don't hear about that very much, because what they've done, or what at least I'm familiar with they've done, is they've started investing in small startups, and really what you're doing in that investment is buying a 50-yard line seat, right? You buy a seat on the board, and then you see what they can do, and you don't burden them with all the problems that you have within the organization. They don't have to go to this training or that training, and etc. You let them focus on the technology, and you create a skunk works that seems to pay off. You know, it seems to work, and I think that's where the synergy is between big oil and the startups. Now, it's different when you start talking about the service companies. When you start talking about Schlumberger's, the Halliburtons, the Neighbors, the H&Ps, those are people that have equipment and skills that we really rely on in our day-to-day design operations, right? So being able to go to those people as really partners, not just investors, but partners, is very important to us. So I would argue that actually, from my standpoint, the service providers are actually more important to me as a partner at this stage of the development of my company than, say, being a partner with a major oil company.
Yeah,
Thank you, Lance.
can I jump in
Yes,
there, Paolo?
please,
do
and then
wonder-
Liz, because
Yeah,
Schlumberger was mentioned, so she has the right to intervene.
All right, Lisa, you going first?
No,
I
it's
know,
okay.
you go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dee.
Yeah, I do wonder, Lance, because I don't disagree with you actually. I think there are different phases on the technology journey, right? So in the initial phase, you don't actually want to be encumbered by a large corporation too early. And I think it also comes back to Paolo's comment earlier. Well, why don't we have geothermal written into the future today? And one of the reasons is that we have a bunch of different types of technologies which show great promise. And yet what we really need are commercialization scale projects to demonstrate that they work at scale, and we can all visualize them being planted around the world. And I wonder if it's in that phase where you're really starting to scale up to commercialization scale and thinking about building a huge portfolio of options on the back end, that makes me think, well, maybe that's when you need the larger corporations to really be active. So letting you work on your development of your technologies and, you know, making sure that you're given the space to experiment. But when you really want to scale up, maybe that's when you want some of the larger companies to be involved. But I'll let Lise speak to Schlumberger, and then I bet Lance will want to come back again.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for the comment, Lance. I appreciate that. I would say we have examples of both. So, you know, in the geothermal space, in fact, we have a startup where it was, I talked about it at Pivot 2020 last year. We had 3 Schlumberger employees with an idea, you know, using geoenergy to heat and cool buildings. And it was one of the first businesses we announced in our Schlumberger New Energy division. But, you know, so they're backed by Schlumberger, technology access, you know, all the things that have been previously mentioned, access to R&D and that network of technical experts, et cetera, the global footprint. If you ask me, would they have been successful without Schlumberger? I'd say absolutely. It was a great idea, but no doubt they're at a point of, you know, ability to commercialize at scale and this pipeline of opportunities faster, I think, because of the backing. But, you know, we have a geothermal business that's been in business since 2010 or so, and we have a partnership, because I think the context of de-risking doesn't just apply with the small big, is especially when you talk cross industry, is that if both come to the party as best in class and coming understanding the risks associated with the competency that they're bringing, like our partner, you know, Geoframe we have is our geothermics, you know, subsurface and drilling expertise in geothermal, with Thermal Energy Partners coming with their experience in geothermal power project development, is when you come to the table knowing you don't know it all, then you have this mindset that you're open to more of that system-based approach that I talked about before. And I think you make better decisions because you have to discuss what are the trade-offs or the unintended consequences, and some of the new traditional kind of new business risk that you might expect gets mitigated through those discussions, as well as you're able to control risk when it happens because you come with those different, you know, broader set of risk management skills. So I think the JVing approach brings value in de-risking both for startups as well as in the space of kind of, the marriage of equals, if you will.
So we have a mountain of questions that are coming from the Q&A, and I will try my best to group them because, and I apologize in advance if we cannot cover all of them, but I would start by grouping some, which, to be a little bit provocative, point the finger on the oil and gas industry in terms of trust. So the first one says, can the panelists give their perspective on past oil and gas divestment in geothermal? How do we know that this is real the time and that these efforts won't get dropped with the price when the price of oil and gas goes up? This is number one. I try to read other ones which are very similar. The world distrusts oil and gas. I'm not saying, I'm reading the questions. That is not the IEA speaking. How can we all get comfortable that this is a real lasting engagement and not a fad? Other things are going into the complementarity, and to some extent this was already answered, but there is one about jobs which I found interesting. Is this the future of the oil and gas workforce? And if yes, why aren't we hearing more about this from oil and gas entities themselves? Now, you are obviously in the spot here as a first, but of course the others are free to comment why there should be more trust now that the engagement of the oil and gas now is more serious. Let's put it in this way. There are similar questions coming, but let's start from you.
So, I'm going to say great questions, right? And these are very relevant to where we are today in the industry. Absolutely. I think it's really important to bear in mind that the oil and gas industry, and some companies more than others, and BP is one of these, have hardwired low carbon ambitions and aims into their strategic frame. And they are serious about them. They put numbers against those aims. And they are actively investing in non-hydrocarbon based energy sources of the future. And they're doing it today. And they're doing it on the scale of billion-dollar investments, multi-gigawatt scale. So that's one piece. And they are accepting that the rates of return for those renewable sources are going to be significantly lower than their hydrocarbon energy sources. So for instance, BP wants to reduce its oil and gas production by 40% within the next decade. That is huge. And it accepts that its current investments in renewables will achieve something around 10% IRR, significantly lower than they ever had from any poorly performing hydrocarbon project in the past. So they are accepting that they will be a different type of company. So why should we trust them in the geothermal space? Well, you said it in the beginning, Paolo, the hydrocarbon industry is also on a bit of a journey with geothermal. It doesn't necessarily see geothermal as the third renewable energy source today. It's got a ways to go with that. And the way that we can help them get to the same position that I'm in and other passionate people are in to have use case, commercial scale geothermal projects working today. Now, why didn't they do this 10 years ago? Because we were looking at a different type of industry. The geothermal industry 10 years ago was geographically limited. Today, we have new technologies which allow us to look at new types of geothermal opportunities. The type of thing where you're not necessarily looking for hot fluids in the subsurface, you're just hunting for temperature and you're creating a reservoir. It's a fundamentally different geothermal industry than it was 10 years ago. Now, will it work? We don't know yet if it will work. But companies like BP are beginning to invest in it because they think there is potential. So the technology is now in that place. Once it's proven itself, I'm pretty sure the companies like BP will be jumping all over it because of all the great attributes that we described earlier. I think there was also a question around the workforce. So we've said it plenty of times in this conversation. We need geologists, we need geophysicists, we need drilling engineers, we need heat production engineers, we need the foundational skill set that the oil and gas industry is based on. Do we need them today? Not today, because the industry is small, okay? But will we need them in 10 years' time? Probably, if the geothermal industry takes off like we all want it to. So is the oil and gas industry going to stand up today and say in 10 years' time, we're all going to be in geothermal? In all honesty, not until we've demonstrated we can make it work at commercial scale. And then organizations like the IAA will start building into their strategy. Organizations like BP will start resourcing it. You know, it'll all fall into place. So we have a real job to do in the next 5 years to prove commerciality of some of these amazing technologies. I think we can do it, but once we've done that, then we can have a really firm promise behind it. But in terms of trust, companies like BP have put metrics out there, and we're trying to get there in terms of renewable energy investment. So that's the measure of trust. Are companies investing in renewable energy sources? And if you see that, then you can be more confident.
I stay 10 seconds more with you, Dee, because there is one question which is really targeting you. Does the CEO of BP, for instance, know about geothermal and the opportunity here? The general question is whether geothermal has reached the C level in the industry or not.
So I haven't spoken to Bernard Looney directly about geothermal, but there are members of his executive team that have reviewed geothermal projects in the past, and we have made the significant investment that we made into Ever. Are they aware of geothermal? They're aware that it's got potential. They're waiting for the technology to grow and advance before we can really go big and offer it as a BP solution, but we're on the pathway.
Okay. Any more views on the, how can I say, how trustful the oil and gas industry is in this field? Shortly, because then I have a question for Sarah, one for Lance, and a general one, including from myself, on the size of what we are really speaking about here in 2030. But first, still a comment on oil and gas?
Yeah, if I can add a comment there.
Of course.
Let's roll back to 2007. Okay, I actually did an interview on BBC on peak oil, and the issue there was Western governments were actually urging the big oil companies for national security reasons to get, secure supplies. And I can tell you, we reacted to that. One of the things we did was move heavily into unconventional resources. Sure. Now, where did we get the resources, the money, and the staff to do that? Well, we shut down our geothermal program. Was that a mistake? I think it probably was, but we were reacting to the pressures of the time. So I'll leave it there.
I think it's an interesting point. And I remember the IEA position on unconventional camming. We were among the first realizing this. Any other comment on this general, how trustful the oil and gas industry is? Otherwise, I go to Sarah with another. But Sarah, you want
to I just want to mention really quickly, I will never
Please.
pass up the opportunity to talk about job creation.
Okay.
I think Dee is right. We're going to create, if this industry can really take off, we're going to create a huge amount of science and engineering-based positions. But, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, working for Schlumberger, I ran a crew of 15 people who were field operators and a 45-man, hitch entirely. And that was just my crew. And not one of those people works for Schlumberger anymore. They all moved back to their small towns in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, and they work for road crews, construction crews at a much lower wage than we paid them at Schlumberger. And I think when you start thinking about, some of the US drilling rig count going to geothermal energy, I think that's something to be really, really excited about from an employment of high wage field labor again. And that's something that, I'm hugely motivated by, the company is hugely motivated by putting these guys who, did huge legwork for Schlumberger back to work. And I think that, the success of this industry would be enormously meaningful for a large percentage of those people. And so I think that's something that we should all get excited about from an oil and gas and geothermal perspective.
Thank you very much. So before I go to the size question, there are two specific questions. One is for you again, Sarah, and it's is Fervo partnering with oil and gas, and why did Fervo decide to partner with Google?
Great questions. Yes, we are partnering with oil and gas, and today we are partnering, like Lance said, with many oil field service companies. We're partnering with H&P. We try to partner with all of the best service companies in class, like Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes. These guys have very, very meaningful expertise to contribute to our operation. And so all of our RFPs are open to those who have participated in oil and gas processes in the past. And we have found partnerships with them to be hugely valuable. We have not yet partnered with any oil and gas companies on the E&P side, but I truly believe that that's going to be in our future in the event that we want to scale our approach. Why did we partner with Google? Google is an incredible forward thinker in terms of zero carbon electricity. They were one of the first who stated publicly that we are going to be a carbon-free electricity company, but then they went further and said we're going to be a 24/7 carbon-free electricity company, which is actually an enormous advancement because they recognize that even if we're buying RECs, that doesn't count. We need to actually be producing or finding electricity that is produced in every hour that we consume it. And so I think that they have really, really been ahead of the curve on understanding what carbon-free means. And, we started working with them a long time ago, and they were compelled by the value proposition that geothermal energy can provide. And I think in the event that we're successful, we can be, sort of exactly what they're looking for in terms of a load matching profile and a good partner. So they have been an incredible partner to work with. And, I hope only that we can be successful for them and then continue to work across the oil and gas industry.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I would like to go to Lance now. Can Sage comment on their recent partnership with Neighbors? I hope I read it correctly. Is oil service and drilling contractors the key to scaling this? Lance?
Well, yeah, we're certainly not going to drill 20,000 geothermal wells a year without the drilling rigs, right? And we're not going to drill it. We're not going to do it without the service companies. I mean, it's just too integral to what we're doing. To Dee's point, big oil is brilliant at scaling up, and I agree with everything you said. When it comes to that phase, when it's time to scale up, nobody does it better than big oil. Nobody knows different countries around the world. Nobody knows how to get things rolling better than big oil. So I do think big oil will come into play once they see, like Sarah said, somebody actually kick a field goal, right? One of us actually delivers something, it's gonna heat up fast. So in terms of Neighbors, so far Neighbors has been a great partner. I mean, so one of the issues we have is all of our modeling, and I think everybody's modeling just says you need big wells, right? And to drill big wells, you need big rigs. And Neighbors is a fantastic partner on addressing the issues we have on going big to get the multiple megawatts that we need out of these wells when we drill them. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So let's go to size a little bit, and just on one thing that you just said, Lance, I hear you carefully in the capability of big oil to scale up. I will not comment on whether big oil took the opportunity of solar or not. I will keep silent on this, but now I'm taking some of the questions from the audience plus from myself. There was one which I really liked. So someone said, what is the moonshot for this industry? What is the geothermal moonshot of these entities? What is the potential to scale that you see in the next decade? And I had the same questions before this panel started. Let me say a few numbers just to put this in a real context. The cumulative total capacity of geothermal today is something like 15 gigawatt, right, in the world. Now, every year, solar and wind install now 250 gigawatt. And in our net zero emission roadmap, we see this going up to 1,000 gigawatts per year. I'm not cumulative, in 2030. So my question to you is, what is the realistic size of a market, not next year, but in 2030? How is your vision? What do you think? Who wants to start?
I'll start. I mean, so the key thing is we get the price down to wind and solar, and the oil and gas industry will deliver on scale, probably even better than what you were talking about, Paolo. Unconventionals in Texas alone drills 20,000 wells a year. You can do the math, 20,000 geothermal wells a year. If we do the same sort of numbers and you use a conservative 3 megawatts per well, we can put a lot of gigawatts online fast with the infrastructure that already exists. I'll make one exception. We're going to need bigger rigs. We'll be able to get by initially with the smaller rigs, but to actually get the 5 megawatt to 10 megawatt wells for geothermal anywhere, we're going to need to be running deep 16-inch or 13 3/8 or 14-inch strings. So we'll need some additional capacity. I think that you said 2030, plenty of time to build a lot of big rigs to get there. And so if any of us can deliver geothermal at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, this will go exponential, and the oil and gas industry and the infrastructure that they have today will be critical for that to go exponential. Thanks.
Thank you, Lance. Because now I'm challenged by yourself, I will add one other question, not just the size, but also the cost. And to be more precise, you mentioned some cost of wind on solar, which are true for California, but in other parts of the world, solar and wind can be much, much cheaper. So anyone else want to comment?
I mean, I'll pop in. I don't think we
Please.
need to get to 30 cents. I think if you look at research being done today, you recognize that, you know, once wind and solar have significant penetration with batteries, it becomes incredibly expensive to put the batteries on the grid that you need in order to store the electricity that we need from a reliability perspective. And so I think, you know, when you recognize that it becomes cost prohibitive upon, you know, even 50, 60, 70% penetration, you recognize the cost for solar plus storage and wind plus storage is going to come up. And so I actually think that we're at a price point today that actually totally and completely makes sense. And so as soon as we, you know, can really drive our learning curves on drilling, then it makes enormous difference. Every single, you know, cent per megawatt we can actually come down. So I don't think we have to be at 30 cents. I love 1,000 gigawatts, Paolo. I think that's great. I think we're well on our way to the demand for that. You know, if you look at the June 2021 California Public Utilities Commission ruling for 1,000 new megawatts of firm, defined as greater than 80% capacity renewable energy to come on the California grid by 2026, which geothermal is 100% suited for, because nuclear, hydro, and biomass all have limitations to be able to fulfill that firm capacity requirement. You recognize that California Public Utilities Commission increased US demand for geothermal energy by 30% overnight. And so I think that that is a domino in a long string of dominoes that's going to increase the demand for geothermal energy. So I think it is probably, if we manage to time warp forward to 2030, we would be mind boggled by the demand for geothermal energy.
Okay, we're starting to hear some numbers. Now, Dee and Liz, Any size, any comments? And we have still 5 minutes for questions and then 5 minutes for a closing remark.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. We're turning into a very agreeable panel here. I think both Lance and Sarah are absolutely right. So there are parts of the world today where geothermal is highly commercial, be it through innovation grants helping in the technology phase or excellent feed-in tariffs. We can make money in certain jurisdictions today. And the market is calling for it, right? So we've got a low carbon hungry market. The market's not going to be the issue. And then we just need to identify those areas where we can hook up to the grid easily. So I think it could be huge, but I also agree with Lance. I think the key thing is one of the startups and or the oil and gas companies need to have that proof point of a commercial scale project that we can then visualize planting around the world. Can it be huge? It can absolutely be huge. But how quickly can we get to that commercial scale project? So we're now looking at 2021. You've given us a timeline of 9 years. Can we get that commercial scale project in the ground in the next 3 years, which will then mean that we can really start investing at scale to get to the multi-gigawatt arena. I mean, we're no different to wind was 5 years ago, right? Offshore wind has now huge, right? 5-10 years ago, it wasn't that big. That's the growth trajectory, and that's what we can meet. It's just drilling, right? We know how to do this. We can do it.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with these comments that were all fairly agreeable. I go back to what I'd said earlier, that there's other things going on that are moving away from what's the cost per installed kilowatt or megawatt or whatever, and saying instead, what is the total system cost, as well as the total system footprint from an emissions perspective, as carbon pricing evolves as well. So anytime you invite that broader system discussion, geothermal won't win every time, but it's losing some now that it would win when you look at the whole piece. In terms of total market, I know you keep asking because you want a number. I'm not going to give you a number. My other panelists are probably more qualified to do that, but what I will say is, we chose our businesses in Schlumberger New Energy, geothermal included. We chose not just because we feel we have the ability to, leverage capability to advance and accelerate innovation, but because we saw, material, substantial, addressable market. That was one of the reasons we selected them. So we are absolutely excited about geothermal. I'll say that.
Excellent. Okay, I realize I didn't get a number yet, so we'll have to come back next year and ask the same question.
That's what IEA does, right?
Yes,
well,
exactly.
We want to help you draw that chart, that geothermal chart, the growth chart.
Sure. I just put in relation with solar, and then I see some differences still, but I hear you. Now, let me go to closing. We have to close in 8 minutes. And from you, I would now ask you something different. Very few of you actually spoke about policies and how policy can help this process. So my question now for you is the following. What are the leading countries? The US is obviously one, but think about broadly. And then if you have only the right to ask one question that you would like to ask to policymakers, what would it be? You go to a certain country and you go there, you can speak with the minister, with the president, I don't know, whatever level, and you ask, you can only have one question for one policy priority area. What is it? Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Lance.
I'd go to Biden and the White House and say, why does oil and gas get exemptions that geothermal don't on permitting? Why does it take 5 years to get a geothermal permit when it takes 18 months to get a drilling permit on federal lands?
Excellent. This was less than 1 minute. Who's next?
I'll speak to the things that work for us. Technology innovation type funds or grants are absolutely fantastic. And there are some jurisdictions, Germany being one, in the EU, which offer fantastic funds that we can apply for that allow us to develop our technology during that riskiest phase for our capital, right? So if we want to invest money in improving technologies, that is the one thing that will change the dial. It allows us to start building that commercial scale project that we all want to build. And the other piece is guaranteed feed-in tariff. That is really helpful to geothermal because it means we can spend that capital in the first 5 to 10 years, the really expensive phase, but we know that we can have that project operational for 20 plus years and have that guaranteed feed-in tariff. So it just gives us stability that we need. It may not be forever, but in this phase of technology development, that's kind of what we need. So I guess my question would be, please can we have innovation grants, and please can we have a guaranteed feed-in tariff for these reasons?
Dee, can I challenge you on one aspect? You mentioned Germany. Of course, this would work in Germany, but how do we make it work in emerging economies where electricity demand is growing? Because Germany electricity demand will go down. So how do we do this in Indonesia or in India or wherever?
Yeah, so you know, I think a feed-in tariff tied to geothermal is something that can be offered in most countries. And then you choose at what level that feed-in tariff sits at. So, you know, what your economy and you think you can tolerate and what your end user can afford to pay is how you would measure that piece. It gives us that stability. It allows us to build a very stable model, which really helps us when we're in our planning phases.
Okay. Liz?
Well, it's the tricky one you gave me for the closing because we don't lobby. So it would be an interesting conversation I would have. I think what I would say is I would certainly, I could ask what data would you need to making this geothermal, you know, more competitive or more of an option? What information would help? But I would not be shy to reiterate the point that Dee made is I think that creating the space for innovation and doing that in a way that's industry agnostic is helpful. And then, you know, we operate in that space.
Okay. Sarah?
I think my question would also be directed to President Biden. If you look at the federal budget request for fiscal year 2022, you see that nuclear energy received a suggested budget of $1.85 billion. And it is an industry that has been subsidized on a multi-billion-dollar level every year since the 1940s. And today provides 20% of US electricity, which is wonderful, and I'm a big fan, but it is not an industry that is growing in this country. Geothermal energy in his budget received $164 million, which has now been revised by Congress to $137 million. Why are we subsidizing an industry that has enormous potential to provide the same types of electricity with the same attributes and is growing today and is in high demand? Why are we providing it with 1/10 of the federal funding, less than 1/10 of the federal funding that we are to nuclear energy today? If you're going to subsidize energies generally, then why not distribute the funds more evenly across renewable energies that are growing?
Thank you, Sarah. This is a legitimate question. Now, I'm conscious that there are many, many other very interesting questions, but we cannot answer them all, and we have to conclude. And I would like to just say in 30 seconds, when I joined the IEA, solar in our scenarios was a little yellow dot, a little one, barely seen. Now it is the fastest expanding technologies of all. And by 2015, our net zero emission roadmap is the first source of primary energy. Now, geothermal has the potential to follow the same pattern. I did not hear the numbers I wanted to hear today, so I'm forced to come back, me or someone else, next year and ask the same questions. But I would like to conclude saying that it was a super interesting discussion. It could have lasted much, much longer. And please, everybody virtually joining me in uploading all the panelists for this very good discussion and this very insight. And I'm sure the conference organizers will also be in the position to answer some other questions in written form, maybe. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Paolo.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Many thanks, and many thanks to Jamie.